It began with a sound I knew all too well, metal striking wood, followed by the rhythmic growl of a cement mixer. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping black coffee in the stillness of an early Saturday morning when it reached my ears. The kind of noise that doesn't just blend into the background, but plants itself firmly in your awareness, demanding you pay attention. Through the lace curtains, I could see the source. There, across the property line, my neighbor, Jerry Stanton, was busy directing a crew of men. They were staking posts, pouring concrete, and moving with a purpose that told me this wasn't some minor repair. No, this was bigger, much bigger. And from the angle of their work, I knew exactly where that structure was headed, straight onto my land. I'd lived in Willow Creek for 32 years. This land wasn't just an address to me. It was the place where my wife Margaret and I had planted our first garden, built our little red barn, and raised our 2 kids before they went off into the world. Every fence post had a memory nailed into it. So when I saw Jerry's men driving rebar into soil that was mine, the kind of soil I'd tilled with my own hands, something inside me tightened. I stepped outside, the cold morning air biting against my flannel shirt. I called out, my voice cutting across the steady hum of work. He turned slowly, wearing that smug half-smile he seemed to keep tucked in his back pocket for moments just like this. "Morning, Robert," he said, as if we were old friends chatting over coffee. "Beautiful day to get some building done. Looks like you're building in the wrong place," I replied, nodding toward the fresh slab of cement creeping over my side of the faded boundary marker. Jerry didn't flinch. "Survey says otherwise," he shrugged. "You might want to check yours." Then, without another word, he turned back to his crew, effectively dismissing me from my own property line. That's when I knew this wasn't some misunderstanding. This was deliberate. The man had money, connections, and a well-known appetite for expanding his holdings. And apparently, my yard was next on his menu. I could have yelled. I could have told him to stop right then and there. But I've learned over the years that there's a time to shout and there's a time to stay quiet, to let a man think he's winning. Jerry was counting on me to lose my temper, to make a scene, maybe even do something that could be turned against me. I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I stepped back, my eyes sweeping over every inch of his construction site. I took note of the concrete truck's license plate. I saw the company name stenciled onto the side of the surveyor's tripod. I memorized where every wooden stake had been driven into the ground. I wasn't just looking, I was collecting. That night, I pulled the dusty property deed from my file cabinet, the one Margaret and I had signed the year we moved in. I laid it out on the kitchen table alongside the old survey map, running my finger along the black ink boundary lines that had stood for decades. There it was, clear as day. My land, my right, my fight. I thought about calling him right then, telling him to tear it down before he got in deeper. But again, that would tip my hand. No, if Jerry wanted to play this like a chess game, I was more than ready to make my moves in silence. Let him think I was doing nothing. Let him sink his money into the wrong ground. Because when the time came, one well-placed phone call would do more damage than any angry shout across the fence. And so, I decided to wait. And watch. And gather everything I needed for the moment when Jerry Stanton would regret underestimating the man next door. What I didn't know then was just how public that moment would become. By Monday morning, the sound of construction had become a permanent feature of my days. The once quiet hum of Willow Creek's early hours was replaced by the sharp whine of power saws and the deep thud of hammers. Jerry's crew moved like ants, efficient, tireless, and without pause, carrying beams, mixing mortar, and bolting together the skeleton of what was clearly becoming a full-blown garage. From my back porch, coffee in hand, I could see the frame stretching farther over the property line, creeping into my yard like a slow-moving tide. The more it grew, the more certain I became. Jerry wasn't just mistaken, he was betting on my silence. In his mind, an older man like me wouldn't have the energy or resources to fight back. That thought alone kept my temper in check. I wasn't about to prove him right. Instead, I began keeping a ledger, not just of dates and times, but of every single violation I could observe. When the cement truck rolled in at 7:13 a.m. on a Thursday, I wrote it down. When one of Jerry's workers tossed an empty coffee cup into my side of the yard, I took a photo. When I overheard Jerry telling one of the men to just push the stakes another foot over, I noted the exact words and the exact time. I wasn't just gathering evidence, I was building a case. That week, I paid a quiet visit to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Sharon, who had worked there longer than anyone could remember, greeted me with the kind of warmth reserved for familiar faces. "Robert, what brings you in today? You finally thinking of selling that place?" "Not exactly," I said with a small smile. "Just need to see the original land surveys. And maybe the last few permits filed by my neighbor." She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Within minutes, I was seated at a table with a stack of manila folders. There it was again, clear boundary lines, measurements that left no room for confusion, and not a single permit that would allow Jerry to build so much as a shed on my property. I thanked Sharon, signed out a certified copy of the records, and slipped them into a protective envelope. That envelope went straight into the fireproof safe in my study, right alongside my deed and the growing stack of photographs. Back at home, Jerry was standing in his yard, supervising the delivery of large steel garage doors. He caught my eye, gave me a mock-friendly wave, and shouted, "Hope you like the view, Robert." I didn't answer. I simply tipped my hat and went back inside. I could feel him getting bolder, more certain that I was beaten. That was good. The more convinced he became, the harder the fall would be. That night, I made another call, not to Jerry, but to someone I trusted. Mark Peterson, an old friend from my working days, who had since become one of the most meticulous real estate attorneys in the county. When I told him what was happening, he chuckled, not out of humor, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who smelled an airtight case. "Robert," he said, "you sit tight. Don't confront him. Don't send a letter. Let him finish every inch of that garage. When it's done, we'll file. He'll have to tear it down, pay the legal fees, and you might just get damages on top." The thought of Jerry pouring tens of thousands into a building he'd have to destroy made my coffee taste sweeter the next morning. As I stood at the window, watching the walls of his garage rise, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't always about striking back fast. Sometimes, the most devastating blow came from letting a man walk deeper into his own trap. And Jerry Stanton was walking in with both feet. By the third week, the garage stood like some steel and concrete monument to Jerry's arrogance. Its shadow spilled halfway across my yard every afternoon, darkening the patch of grass where I used to sit with a book in summer. The scent of fresh lumber hung in the air, mixing with the faint tang of wet cement. Jerry had switched from polite smugness to open displays of ownership. He no longer pretended the structure might be within his boundary. Instead, he leaned on his fence post each evening, like a man surveying his land, talking loudly on the phone about his new addition while gesturing toward my side. I kept my distance but didn't break my routine. Coffee in the morning, a slow walk to the mailbox, quiet evenings in my study. Every so often, I would wander to the far corner of my yard, measuring tape in hand, pretending to check something. Jerry would watch from his deck, grinning like he was enjoying a private joke. He thought I was just an old man trying to convince himself nothing was wrong. What he didn't know was that every one of those pretend checks was timed with a quick snap of my phone's camera. The ledger on my desk was thick now, dates, timestamps, photos of every stage of his garage's encroachment. The concrete slab, the beams, the siding, each entry was a brick in the wall I was building around him. One rainy Thursday, I got an unexpected call from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Linda Harris. She lived 2 streets over, a sharp-eyed widow with a knack for knowing everyone's business. "Robert," she said without preamble, "I heard about what Jerry's doing. You know he pulled the same stunt on the Caldwells 5 years ago. I didn't. He built a fence 3 feet into their property. They didn't have the fight in them to challenge it, so they let it go. I suppose he figured if it worked once, it'd work again. That little piece of history was gold." I invited Linda over for coffee the next morning. She brought with her a manila folder of her own, a collection of neighborhood committee minutes, old complaint letters, and even a photo of Jerry's fence victory from years back. It painted a picture of a man who thrived on bullying his neighbors into silence. "Men like him," Linda said, stirring sugar into her cup, "don't expect someone to take notes. They expect bluster, shouting, maybe a letter from a lawyer that they can ignore. But they can't argue with cold, hard paper." I smiled. "Then I suppose it's time we start stacking that paper." By now, Jerry's crew had started installing insulation and wiring. The siding was halfway up, a crisp gray that contrasted sharply with my weathered cedar fence. It looked out of place, because it was out of place. I knew every nail they drove in was another $1 Jerry wouldn't see again. One evening, as the workers were packing up, Jerry crossed the property line without hesitation and stood in my yard, admiring his half-built kingdom. "Robert," he said, not bothering to mask his glee, "when it's done, you should come by for a drink in the new garage. Might even let you borrow it when you need the space." I looked him in the eye and replied evenly, "I'll keep that in mind, Jerry." Inside, I could feel my patience stretching thinner by the day. But Mark's words echoed in my head, "Let him finish every inch." The truth was, my patience wasn't just strategic, it was also deeply satisfying. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that when the time came, Jerry wouldn't just lose the garage. He'd lose the illusion of being untouchable. And for a man like him, that loss would hurt more than anything money could fix. The day after Jerry's little "borrow my garage" taunt, I drove into town under the excuse of picking up supplies. My real stop was the county records office, a beige, unremarkable building sandwiched between a pawn shop and a diner that still served coffee in chipped mugs. I'd been there before, years ago, when I'd settled the boundary lines after buying my place. Back then, the clerk, Helen, was a young woman with a sharp bob haircut and a way of chewing gum that suggested she didn't miss much. Now, she was older, but the eyes were the same, sharp, curious, and impossible to fool. "Robert Harrison," I said when she looked up. "I'm here for my property plat map, current version. And while you're at it, can you pull the one for Jerry Cole's parcel next door?" Helen arched a brow. "He the one putting up that garage?" I gave a slow nod. You've heard? Let's just say his contractor doesn't whisper. She pushed her glasses higher and tapped at her keyboard, printing 2 crisp sheets. With the precise click of a stapler, she slid them across to me. Side by side, the maps told the whole story. My lot line was exactly where I'd always known it to be. And Jerry's new addition, it extended a good 12 feet over. Helen tapped the overlapping lines with her pen. That's not a miscalculation. That's arrogance. I folded the maps and slipped them into my leather portfolio, feeling the first real shift in momentum. The evidence was no longer just mine. It had an official stamp now. My next stop was the small law office on Maple Street. Mark was waiting with coffee, his tie slightly askew, sleeves rolled up like he was halfway between paperwork and a fight. "Got the maps?" he asked. I laid them out on his desk, my notes and photos beside them. Mark took his time, eyes narrowing as he pieced together the timeline. "Robert, this is bulletproof. You've got the build progress documented. You've got the official plat," and he held up Linda's old neighborhood minutes, a history of similar behavior. "This isn't going to court. Not the way you think. We'll make one phone call when it's time, and they'll have no choice but to act." I leaned back in the chair. Timing. He tapped the edge of the map. Let him finish. Let him install the doors, run the power, and make it look like his proudest achievement. That's when the hit will hurt most. It was a strange thing, playing the waiting game. Each day, I'd watch from my kitchen window as the garage took shape, my hand wrapped around a mug of black coffee, steam curling into the morning light. Jerry would wave sometimes, that same smug grin plastered on his face, and I'd return it with a neutral nod. What he didn't see were the quiet moves I was making in the background. Linda, bless her, took it upon herself to collect community concern signatures. No official complaint yet, just a friendly letter from several neighbors noting their interest in property lines being respected. She even got the Caldwells to sign, the couple Jerry had steamrolled years back. By week's end, the garage had siding on all sides, shingles nailed into place, and a brand new roll-up door. Jerry threw a little gathering that Saturday, a half-dozen buddies drinking beer and admiring his investment. From my porch, I could hear the laughter and the clink of bottles. "Looks solid, Jerry," one of them called. "Bet you'll get decades out of that thing." "Oh, I will," Jerry boasted. "It's on the best spot of land in the neighborhood." He said it loud enough that I caught every word. I smiled into my coffee. The best spot of land that isn't yours. The truth was, I wasn't just building a case, I was building anticipation. For me, for Mark, even for Linda. The beauty of the plan lay in its simplicity, one well-timed call to the county enforcement office, backed by the right documents, and the whole structure would go from Jerry's pride to Jerry's problem overnight. By the time dusk fell, the garage stood complete, its paint still smelling fresh, a spotlight casting it in almost theatrical light. And I knew, Jerry thought the final curtain had already dropped. He had no idea the real show hadn't even begun. The first frost of the season hit on a Tuesday morning, painting the grass silver and turning my breath into small clouds as I stepped onto the porch. Across the property line, Jerry's brand new garage stood like a freshly crowned king, immaculate, bold, and entirely on land that wasn't his. I didn't look at it long. I had other things to do. Inside, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the thick file I'd been compiling. Maps, photographs, witness statements, and even a dated survey from a decade ago, all neat, all numbered. I added the most recent set of photos I'd taken over the weekend, showing the garage fully finished, complete with a custom-made weather vane shaped like a vintage car. It was almost too perfect. Linda dropped by later that morning with a Tupperware of banana bread. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," she said, setting it on my kitchen table. I raised a brow. "You've been talking to the Caldwells again?" She smirked. "Of course. They're still angry about how Jerry treated them. They said they'd be happy to testify if it came to that." I nodded, grateful but cautious. We might not need a courtroom. Just the right trigger at the right time. Over the next week, I kept my distance, both physically and in conversation. Jerry mistook my silence for surrender. I could tell by the way he strolled around the property line, hands in pockets, like a man who believed the land bent to his will. He even started parking his truck at an angle, half on his driveway and half in front of my mailbox. Small moves, meant to irritate. I let them pass. What Jerry didn't know was that Mark, my lawyer, had already made quiet contact with the county zoning officer, a man named Tom who'd been in the job long enough to hate unnecessary paperwork, but loved a clean, enforceable case. Mark fed him just enough to spark interest without tipping Jerry off. The plan was simple: wait until Jerry had everything connected, electric, shelving, insulation, so that tearing it down wouldn't just be a loss of a building, but of time, money, and pride. By the second week of November, that moment had nearly arrived. I watched as electricians ran conduit from Jerry's house to the garage, burying cable beneath a shallow trench. He paced alongside them like a general on a battlefield, pointing and giving orders. One afternoon, I caught Linda on her porch, leaning on the railing with a cup of tea. "He's getting awfully comfortable," she said. I followed her gaze to where Jerry was unpacking boxes labeled tools and car parts. "Good," I replied. "Comfort is the first step toward complacency." The cold deepened as Thanksgiving approached. Jerry strung up a line of bright white lights along the garage roof, the glow reflecting off the frost at night. It was almost poetic, him decorating his own downfall without realizing it. I spent those evenings by the fire, flipping through the old leather-bound journal I kept after my wife passed. She'd always told me not to let people walk over me, that respect was something you protected as fiercely as property. Sitting there, the crackle of the fire in my ears, I knew this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about sending a message, not only to Jerry, but to anyone who thought age made a man invisible. The day before Thanksgiving, Mark called. "We're ready," he said. "The documentation's airtight. The county's already got the demolition contractor on standby. One phone call, Robert. You name the day." I didn't hesitate. "We wait until after Christmas. Let him show it off. Let him brag. The fall will be harder." Mark chuckled. "Cold, Robert. I like it." As I hung up, I glanced out the window at Jerry's masterpiece. The wind rattled the lights strung along the eaves, making them sway like little warning signs he couldn't yet read. The truth was, I could have ended it right then. But revenge, I'd learned, isn't just about the strike, it's about the silence before it. The moment when your opponent believes, without question, that they've already won. And I was getting very, very close to that moment. By the first week of December, Jerry's garage wasn't just a building anymore, it was a monument. He had it lit like a Christmas display, with spotlights angled up from the ground so it glowed against the winter night. Anyone driving past couldn't miss it. I'd catch him out there on weekends, leaning against the open doorway, chatting with neighbors like he'd built the Taj Mahal. He was proud, too proud, which made him predictable. Mark called me on a Monday morning, his voice brisk. The county wants to know when to move. They've got the legal paperwork ready. Just say the word." I sipped my coffee, letting the steam warm my face. "Not yet," I said. "We need an audience." There was a pause on the line. "You mean?" "Yes," I replied. "We'll time it for when everyone's around. A public spectacle. He wanted everyone to see it go up. Now they'll see it come down." Mark gave a short laugh. "Robert, you're a patient man, but you're also a dangerous one when crossed." That week, I began the subtle work of arranging the scene. Linda was an invaluable ally. She was plugged into the neighborhood grapevine and knew exactly when Jerry was planning his big Christmas Eve party. He'd sent out invites to practically everyone on the block. From what Linda heard, he planned to open the garage that night and show off his restoration space for the vintage car he'd been bragging about for months. Perfect. I spent the next few days making quiet calls. The county zoning office was more than happy to accommodate the date, especially once they understood the optics. A zoning violation wasn't exactly exciting work for them, but this would be talked about for years. The snow began to fall heavier in the days leading up to Christmas, blanketing the yards and muffling the world. I shoveled my walkway in the crisp morning air, pretending not to notice Jerry watching from across the way. He gave me a nod, a smug little lift of his chin, as if he thought I was finally accepting my new view of his property. I nodded back. No words, just a silent agreement in his mind that I was beaten. On December 20th, the county inspector stopped by my house. Tom was a wiry man in his 60s with a no-nonsense attitude. He pulled off his gloves and laid out the final documents on my kitchen table. "All we need is your confirmation," he said. I signed, the pen scratching softly against the paper. "December 24th, I told him. First thing in the morning." Tom arched an eyebrow. "Christmas Eve." "Exactly," I said. "And make sure they bring the crew, the trucks, the whole operation. I want this by the book." When he left, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the snowflakes swirl in the wind. My wife would have understood. She always said the best way to deal with arrogance was to let it trip over itself. That night, Linda called. "You sure about this, Robert? It's going to cause a scene." I smiled into the receiver. "That's the point," she laughed softly. "Then I'll make sure I've got a front row seat." Over the next few days, I carried on as if nothing was amiss. I waved at Jerry when I saw him, even complimented his Christmas lights. His guard dropped further, his swagger growing by the day. On the evening of December 23rd, I stepped out onto my porch and looked across at the glowing garage. The laughter from inside spilled into the cold night, warm and confident. Tomorrow morning, that laughter would be gone, and in its place would be the sound of engines, chains, and walls coming down. The morning of December 24th was as crisp and sharp as a blade. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale orange glow across the snow-covered neighborhood when I slipped into my boots and stepped onto the porch. My breath plumed in the cold air, but inside my chest there was nothing but fire. I didn't need an alarm clock that morning. Anticipation had kept me awake most of the night. For weeks I had waited, letting Jerry's arrogance grow unchecked. Today was the day it would collapse. By 8 o'clock, the low rumble of diesel engines echoed down the street. One by one, the county trucks rolled in, flatbeds with equipment, a pickup with inspectors, and even a sheriff's cruiser for good measure. It was a parade of authority, their flashing hazard lights bouncing off the snowbanks. I stayed on my porch, coffee in hand, as neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Some came outside, tugging on hats and scarves, curious about the early commotion. Jerry, of course, was still asleep. His party had gone late the night before. I knew because I'd watched cars line the street until after midnight, music spilling from his house as if he owned the whole block. The knock on his door was firm, delivered by the sheriff himself. A few minutes later, Jerry stumbled out in a robe, hair mussed, face pale from the cold and the sight before him. His eyes darted from the trucks to the inspector, holding a clipboard. "What's this about?" he barked, voice hoarse. "Tom," the inspector spoke evenly. "Morris, this structure was built in violation of county zoning laws. It sits 10 feet over the property line onto your neighbor's land. Today, by court order, it comes down." For a moment, silence hung in the frosty air. Then Jerry laughed, though it came out more like a desperate bark. "You've got to be kidding me. On Christmas Eve, this is harassment." But Tom was unmoved. He handed over the papers, stamped and signed. "You had multiple notices. You ignored them. This is the result." I watched from across the street as the color drained from Jerry's face. He turned, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, his eyes met mine. There was no smugness now, only disbelief. I raised my coffee cup in a small salute. The crew wasted no time. Within minutes, the trucks were in position, workers unspooling chains and firing up machinery. The sound of engines and metal clinking filled the air. The neighborhood gathered, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. Linda slipped up beside me, bundled in her red scarf. "Robert, you really did it," she whispered, eyes wide with both awe and amusement. I didn't answer. I just kept watching. Jerry tried to argue, pacing in the snow, gesturing wildly. He pleaded with Tom, cursed at the sheriff, even shouted at the workers. But nothing stopped the inevitable. The first strike came when a worker swung a chain into the garage door, bending the shiny metal inward with a sickening crunch. A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Jerry shouted, "Stop, that's brand new." But the workers kept going, methodical and steady. By 10 o'clock, the garage that had stood so proudly 2 weeks before was a broken skeleton of beams and siding. Each crash of timber was like a drumbeat, each groan of collapsing walls a note in the song of justice. Neighbors whispered among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, others smirked. One man muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Guess Jerry finally bit off more than he could chew." Linda chuckled softly. "Poetic, isn't it? He wanted everyone to admire it, and now they're all here to watch it fall." I felt no need to gloat. The sight was enough. Watching arrogance crumble into dust was a kind of revenge that required no words. Jerry stood there helpless, robe pulled tight around him, his slippers sinking into the snow. For once, he had no audience to cheer him on, only witnesses to his humiliation. By noon, the garage was gone. Not a proud monument anymore, just a heap of splintered wood and twisted metal waiting to be hauled away. The sheriff handed Jerry a final document. "You'll be billed for the demolition, and there will be fines. Consider this a lesson." Jerry didn't respond. He just stood staring at the wreckage, his breath ragged in the cold air. I turned to Linda. "Come on, let's get inside where it's warm." As we walked back toward my porch, the weight that had pressed on me for months lifted. Justice had been served, and not in a dark corner where no one would know. It had been delivered in the clear light of day, before the very eyes Jerry had once sought for his triumph. And this time, those eyes weren't admiring, they were remembering. Because no one on that street would forget what they had seen on Christmas Eve. The neighborhood felt strangely quiet the day after Christmas Eve, as though the heavy clang of steel and the crash of collapsing beams had drained the street of its usual rhythm. Snow still covered the lawns, but where Jerry's proud garage had once stood, there was only a scar of churned-up dirt, broken boards, and a half-frozen puddle of oil that reflected the weak winter sun. From my kitchen window, I watched a pair of county workers come back to load the remaining debris onto their flatbed truck. Their movements were efficient, practiced, and without ceremony. To them, it was just another job. But to me, and certainly to Jerry, it was something much larger. A reminder carved into the land itself that arrogance carries a cost. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through me. For the first time in months, I felt no heaviness in my chest. The anxiety that had haunted me since Jerry began encroaching on my property had evaporated with the sight of those walls falling. Linda called me that morning, her voice full of the kind of delight she didn't bother hiding. "Robert, I swear the whole neighborhood is buzzing. I was at the bakery this morning, and 2 different people brought it up before I even said hello. Jerry's name is on everyone's lips, and not in the way he likes." I chuckled softly. Let him stew in it. He wanted attention. Well, now he has it. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for a walk. The air was crisp, and each step crunched on the packed snow of the sidewalk. People I barely knew nodded or waved, their eyes lingering on me a moment longer than usual. I knew what they were thinking. There goes the man who stood his ground. As I passed Jerry's house, I saw him sitting on his porch, bundled in a thick coat. His usual swagger was nowhere to be seen. His shoulders were hunched, his gaze fixed on the empty spot where the garage had stood. When he finally noticed me, his expression hardened, but there was no power in it, just a flicker of wounded pride. "You think you won, don't you?" he muttered, loud enough for me to hear across the fence. I stopped, meeting his glare. "I didn't win, Jerry. The law did. You built on land that wasn't yours. Actions have consequences." His jaw worked, but he said nothing more. I left him there, staring at the wreckage of his own doing. That evening, Linda stopped by with a casserole dish. She placed it on my counter with a smile. "You deserve this, Robert. After all that nonsense, you've earned a little peace." We ate together at the table, the soft glow of the Christmas lights outside filtering through the window. She leaned back in her chair with a satisfied sigh. "Do you realize, Robert, that you didn't just protect your land? You reminded all of us that we don't have to put up with people like him. Everyone's been so tired of his showboating, but no one wanted to say anything. You did." I shrugged modestly, though her words struck deep. "I didn't set out to make an example. I just wanted what was mine respected. And that," Linda said firmly, "is exactly why it matters." Over the following week, the change in Jerry was impossible not to notice. The man who once strutted around in his leather jacket, calling out greetings as if the block belonged to him, now kept to himself. His parties stopped. His driveway, once lined with cars, was empty. He still shoveled his walk, but he did it quickly, eyes down, avoiding the glances of passing neighbors. Meanwhile, life on my side of the street felt lighter. Neighbors stopped me on walks to offer a few words, some congratulatory, others quietly admiring. "Good on you, Robert," one said. Not everyone would have had the patience or the guts. I never boasted. I never rubbed it in Jerry's face. I didn't need to. His humiliation was its own punishment, replayed every time he stepped outside and saw nothing but an empty patch of frozen earth where his pride had stood. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the silence. For months, his voice had carried across our lawns, full of laughter and arrogance. Now the quiet felt like justice. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my porch as fireworks bloomed faintly in the distance. The cold nipped at my skin, but inside, I felt warm. The world has a way of righting itself when people overstep. Jerry thought he could take what wasn't his, thought he could intimidate me into silence. But the law had spoken, and the street had witnessed it. And I knew, as surely as the snow would melt come spring, that Jerry would never dare test those boundaries again. January in Maplewood had always been a slow month. The holidays were over, the lights dimmed, and the town seemed to sink into a quiet lull until spring. But that year the silence felt heavier, especially around Jerry's place. For weeks after the demolition, he remained withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone. His driveway stayed empty, his porch lights off. Some neighbors even whispered that he might put the house up for sale. I half believed it myself. But pride, as I would soon learn, doesn't let a man like Jerry vanish quietly. It started with the sound of hammering one frosty morning. I was out shoveling my walk when I noticed two men hauling lumber into Jerry's backyard. At first, I thought he might be repairing storm damage. But as the days went on, it became clear Jerry was trying to rebuild. Not the garage, at least not in the same way, but a massive shed that still leaned suspiciously close to my property line. I felt a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Hadn't he learned? The county order had been explicit. Yet here he was, dragging his pride back from the rubble. Linda noticed it too. One evening, she came by with a pot of chili, shaking her head. "Robert, he's at it again. Folks at the hardware store said he practically bought out their lumber stock. He's been telling people he'll make this new one even bigger and better." I sighed, rubbing my temples. The man's either stubborn or foolish. Probably both. But while Jerry hammered and sawed, I stayed patient. This wasn't my first battle, and I knew better than to rush into confrontation. The law was on my side, and this time I intended to let it speak louder than before. Weeks later, the frame of the shed stood tall, its shadow once again falling over the edge of my yard. One Saturday morning, Jerry spotted me outside, and for the first time since the demolition, swaggered over. His smirk was back, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Enjoying the view, Robert?" he asked, gesturing to the half-built structure. "Don't worry, this one's all legal. I've got it under control." I met his gaze calmly. "You might want to double-check that. County ordinances don't bend for ego." His face tightened, but he forced a laugh. "We'll see who gets the last word this time." I didn't argue. I simply returned to my yard work, though inside I was already making calls. By mid-February, the county inspector had been out twice. Jerry's permits, as it turned out, were not in order. He had applied for something minor, a garden structure, but what he was building went far beyond that. The inspector's tone was firm when I overheard him. "Tear it down, or we'll do it for you." Again, Jerry's roar of frustration echoed across the street that day. He slammed doors, shouted at the workers, even cursed at the inspector. But the outcome was inevitable. Within a week, the frame came down, leaving yet another pile of wasted wood at the edge of his property. The second demolition didn't bring cheers or whispers from the neighborhood. It brought laughter. People couldn't believe he'd been foolish enough to try again. One evening, while I was walking home from the store, a younger couple from down the block stopped me. "You've got more patience than we would have had," the husband said, grinning. "If he'd built that mess next to our yard, we would have lost it. You handled it perfectly." Their words warmed me. I hadn't sought recognition, but it was gratifying to know others saw the quiet fight I'd waged. Meanwhile, Jerry's pride was in tatters. His driveway became a graveyard of half-finished projects, wood scraps, rusted tools, abandoned nails. He tried to reclaim his old reputation by hosting a small gathering one weekend, but few people came, and those who did left early, murmuring afterward about how desperate he seemed. Linda summed it up best one afternoon over tea. "He doesn't realize it yet, Robert, but this isn't just about garages or sheds. It's about respect. And respect isn't built with wood and nails. It's earned." I nodded, staring across at Jerry's dim porch light. "And once it's lost, it's hard to get back." Spring eventually came, and with it the sound of birds and the thaw of snow. My garden bloomed again, free from shadows. And though Jerry still lived across the way, he no longer strutted or boasted. His pride had been broken twice, not by me directly, but by the rules he thought he could ignore. And deep down, I knew this was the real revenge, not just in tearing down what he built, but in watching him realize that his empire of arrogance had no foundation strong enough to stand. The weeks after Jerry's second demolition felt different in Maplewood. For the first time since I'd moved there, the man across the street no longer strutted with that overblown confidence. His once pristine driveway, where he used to polish his truck every Sunday, now sat cluttered with scraps and broken dreams. It wasn't just the property line he had crossed, it was his pride. And pride, once it collapses, takes everything else with it. I noticed small details first. His wife Martha, who used to wave politely from their porch, no longer appeared in the evenings. The cheerful flowers she once kept in planters out front dried up and disappeared. Their daughter Emily, who was home from college that spring, came and went quickly, never staying long enough for the old neighborhood gossip sessions she used to enjoy with Linda. One evening, I was trimming the hedges when I overheard sharp voices carrying across the quiet street. Jerry's tone was harsh, defensive, while Martha's sounded tired, like a woman who'd been carrying the weight of her husband's arrogance for too many years. "You promised it would be different this time," she snapped. "You said the shed was all legal, that you knew what you were doing." "It was," Jerry shot back, though even from my yard I could hear the tremor in his voice. "Those inspectors are just out to get me. And Robert, he's feeding them lies, you'll see." There was a pause before Martha's reply, heavy with resignation. "Robert didn't force you to lie on permit applications. Robert didn't make you waste our savings on lumber that ended up in the trash. That's on you, Jerry." The silence afterward was more powerful than the argument itself. It was the silence of truth settling in. From that night on, Martha's car was often gone for hours at a time. Some said she was spending more nights at her sister's place in town. Emily stopped bringing friends over altogether. Even Jerry's dog, an old retriever named Duke, seemed to spend more time wandering my yard than his. Linda noticed too. Over coffee one morning, she leaned toward me and whispered, "He's not just losing face with the neighbors, Robert. He's losing face with his own family. And that kind of loss cuts deeper than any wrecking crew could." She was right. I didn't revel in Jerry's domestic troubles, but it was hard to ignore the irony. For years, he had made himself out to be the king of the block, his word final, his ego untouchable. Now inside his own walls, his reign was crumbling. The final blow came on a Sunday afternoon. Jerry had invited a few of his old drinking buddies over, likely hoping to prove he still had some control. But the gathering ended in disaster. I was in my living room, reading, when the shouting began. Through the window, I saw Jerry's friends filing out of his house, shaking their heads. One of them, a stocky fellow with a red ball cap, turned back and yelled, "We're tired of hearing excuses, Jerry. Maybe if you'd listened for once, you wouldn't be the town's punchline." The door slammed, and for the first time, I saw Jerry standing alone on his porch, shoulders slumped, his swagger gone. He glanced across the street toward me, and for a brief second, our eyes met. His face wasn't angry that day. It was hollow, almost pleading, though he quickly turned away. The man who once tried to overshadow me with his garage now stood dwarfed by his own mistakes. By spring's end, Martha officially moved out, taking Emily with her. The house grew darker, emptier, its yard unkempt. Neighbors who once tolerated Jerry's antics now openly mocked his downfall. At the market, I overheard someone chuckling. He lost his garage, his shed, and now his family. That's karma, if I've ever seen it. And yet, despite it all, Jerry still tried to save face. He'd mow the lawn in stiff silence, pretending not to notice the whispers. He'd polish his truck alone, as if clinging to the last shred of control he had left. But respect, true respect, had slipped through his fingers, and deep down, I think he knew there was no rebuilding it this time. Spring in Maplewood brought more than blooming trees and warmer days. It brought the county's annual land review meeting. It wasn't the sort of event most folks cared about, but for those of us who'd had our property lines challenged or our voices ignored, it mattered more than we cared to admit. I hadn't planned to speak that evening. Truth be told, I was content to let my life stay quiet now that Jerry had been put in his place. But fate has a way of nudging you into the spotlight when you least expect it. When Linda and I walked into the courthouse that evening, I noticed right away how many heads turned. People who once treated me like the quiet old man who lived across from Jerry now nodded with respect. A few even stopped to shake my hand. "Robert," one neighbor said warmly, "I heard how you handled that whole mess with Jerry. Took a lot of patience. Most men would have blown their top." I smiled politely, though inside I felt a mix of pride and surprise. For years, Jerry's voice had drowned out mine in neighborhood matters. Now folks were coming to me. We took our seats near the back, but the county commissioner, a sharp man named Harold Jacobs, soon spotted me. Adjusting his glasses, he called out, "Mr. Robert Turner, would you join us up front for a moment?" A hush fell over the room. My first instinct was to decline, but Linda nudged me gently. "Go on," she whispered. So I stood, my knees a little stiff, and walked to the front. "Mr. Turner," Commissioner Jacobs began, "we'd like to recognize your persistence and your commitment to lawful property ownership. Too often, people think they can bend the rules or bully their neighbors. You've shown that patience and principle can prevail." The applause that followed startled me. I had never sought applause for simply defending what was mine. Yet there I was, standing in front of the very people who once overlooked me, receiving their respect. Then the commissioner dropped a bombshell. "After reviewing the repeated violations from your neighbor, Mr. Cole, and considering the integrity you've maintained, the county has decided to extend your property rights to include additional protective zoning. This means no further construction can occur within 50 feet of your boundary without explicit approval. You'll have the final say." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I knew exactly who was sitting just a few rows back. Jerry Cole, his face turning redder by the second. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "You're giving him power just because he plays the victim. I've lived in that neighborhood longer than—" "Order, Mr. Cole," the commissioner cut in firmly. "This isn't about tenure, it's about respect for the law and for one's neighbors." Jerry muttered under his breath, but sat down, his fists clenched on his knees. As for me, I simply nodded and thanked the board. I wasn't interested in gloating. It wasn't my style, but deep down, I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of knowing the man who had tried to dominate me for so long now had to live under my say-so. On our way out, several people approached me, offering congratulations. One even joked, "Robert, you're practically the sheriff of Maplewood now." Linda chuckled, slipping her hand into mine. "See what happens when you stand your ground," she whispered. That night, as I sat on our porch with a cup of tea, I looked across at Jerry's darkened house. For years he had been the loudest voice in the room. Now, even in silence, his downfall echoed louder than all his boasts combined. The county hadn't just handed me recognition, they had handed me a shield, and for Jerry, that shield was a wall he could never climb again. The week after the county meeting, you could practically taste the bitterness coming off Jerry's property. His lawn, once trimmed within an inch of its life, now looked neglected. His truck sat in the driveway with dust coating the hood, and the man himself seemed to have shrunk, though not in size, but in spirit. Still, a man like Jerry doesn't fold quietly. Pride is a stubborn thing, and his had been built over decades of barking orders and expecting the world to bow. It wasn't going to dissolve just because a county commissioner said I had more rights than him. Sure enough, it started small. One morning I found trash bags dumped on my side of the line, soggy leaves, broken bottles, and scraps of wood. I didn't need a detective to know who'd put them there. But instead of storming over, I quietly dragged them back to his driveway. Not a word spoken, just a clear message. Then came the noise. At odd hours, Jerry revved his truck engine, blasted music, even set off firecrackers one night, startling Linda awake. She looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Robert, he's trying to bait you." And she was right. Every trick, every petty act was designed to pull me into the mud with him. But I refused. One Friday evening, as I was watering the garden, Jerry finally cracked. He marched over, red-faced, veins bulging, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "That meeting didn't mean a thing. People here know I built this neighborhood. Not you. Me. You're just some washed-up old man who lucked into sympathy." I leaned on the hose and looked at him steadily. "Jerry, you're right about one thing. People do know you. They've seen how you behave, and they've made their judgment." That only fueled his fury. He shoved his finger closer to my face. "You think you're better than me? I'll take you down, Robert. You don't have the fight left in you." Before I could answer, a voice from across the street cut in. "Leave him be, Jerry." It was my neighbor, a young man named Derek, who usually kept to himself. He stepped onto his porch, arms crossed. "We're tired of your nonsense. You're the reason this street's had nothing but drama for years." Another voice joined in. "Mrs. Wilson, the widow from the corner house. Robert's shown more class in a month than you have in 20 years, Jerry. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." Jerry froze. For the first time, it wasn't just me standing against him, it was the whole neighborhood. People he thought were loyal to his bluster were now siding with the man he tried to bully. He sputtered, looking from one house to another, his face pale beneath the anger. Then, without another word, he stomped back across his yard, slamming his door so hard it rattled the windows. Linda came out to join me, slipping her arm through mine. "You didn't even have to raise your voice," she said softly. "No," I answered, looking around at the faces watching from porches and windows. Turns out I never had to. Jerry's downfall wasn't mine to cause. It was his own. That night, as I sat on the porch, the neighborhood quieter than it had been in years, I realized Jerry had played his last card. And he had lost. Not to me, not to the county board, but to his own pride. The man who built his identity on being feared now had nothing left but silence, and the bitter knowledge that the very people he once lorded over saw him for what he truly was. And me? I didn't feel like a conqueror. I felt like a man who'd reclaimed his peace, one quiet day at a time. For the first time in years, the street felt like it had exhaled. The tension that used to hover like humidity over the summer air was gone. Instead of neighbors rushing inside to avoid one of Jerry's tirades, people lingered on porches, chatted at fences, and waved as they walked their dogs. It amazed me how quickly things changed once Jerry's grip on the neighborhood broke. His intimidation had worked for so long because no one wanted to be the target of his wrath. But now, after the county hearing and his public outburst, his power evaporated. Linda noticed it too. "Feels like we live in a different place, doesn't it?" she said one morning as she sipped her coffee on the porch swing. I nodded. Like the whole street's lighter. Sometimes one man's poison can seep into everything. Remove it, and the air clears. But Jerry hadn't left. His house still stood next door, though it was quieter than ever. The once pristine lawn grew patchy. The paint on his shutters peeled, and the bluster that used to define him was replaced with drawn curtains and silence. Occasionally, I saw him through the window, slumped in a chair, staring at the TV. And though I'd be lying if I said I felt sympathy, I didn't feel triumph either. He had sown his own misery, watered it with arrogance, and now lived in the harvest of loneliness. Meanwhile, life for Linda and me began to bloom again. Without Jerry's disruptions, we found ourselves hosting little dinners with neighbors. Mrs. Wilson brought her famous peach cobbler, Derek grilled steaks, and even families we barely knew before started dropping by to share stories and laughter. One evening, after everyone left, Linda leaned against the counter while I washed dishes. "You know, Robert, I don't think it's just the end of Jerry's noise. It's the way you handled it. People saw you didn't fight fire with fire. That made all the difference." Her words stuck with me. I hadn't thought of it that way. To me, I had just chosen the only path I could manage. Silence where shouting would only worsen things, patience where anger would have cost me my health. Yet in choosing restraint, I'd given others permission to stand tall too. And slowly, I realized something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about reclaiming my land or proving Jerry wrong. It was about reclaiming dignity, not just mine, but for everyone who had been living under his shadow. One afternoon, Derek came by while I was fixing a loose shutter. He leaned against the porch rail and said, "You know, Robert, I wish I'd spoken up sooner. Watching you stand firm without losing your temper, it made me realize we don't have to accept people like him running the show." I smiled, tightening the last screw. Better late than never. Sometimes it only takes one spark. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how life had turned a corner. Peace had returned, yes, but more than that, community had returned. The very thing Jerry tried to break, neighborly trust, was what rose up to undo him. And in that quiet realization, I felt something even sweeter than revenge. I felt home. The winter sun was setting early that day, casting long shadows across the street as Linda and I prepared dinner. From our kitchen window, I noticed Jerry standing in his driveway, shoulders hunched against the cold. For months he'd been quieter, keeping to himself, but now he seemed almost restless, like a man trying to claw back the pieces of a life he once commanded. Later that evening, Derek stopped by with news. "You'll want to hear this," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "Jerry's been petitioning the county to appeal the demolition order. He thinks he can get the garage rebuilt." I laughed, not cruelly, but in disbelief. After everything, he still hasn't learned. Derek shrugged. Some men don't know how to quit. But I wasn't worried. Not anymore. Because this time, the tables had fully turned. Instead of Jerry intimidating me, I had the full backing of the county and the neighborhood. The next week, the hearing was held at the county courthouse. Linda came with me, and so did half the street. Jerry walked in wearing his old smug expression, but it cracked when he saw the rows of familiar faces seated against him. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't gloat or throw insults. I simply laid out the truth. This land has been mine for decades. He knew it when he built on it, and he ignored every warning. Now, after repeated notices, he wants another chance. But a man who never respected boundaries will never stop crossing them. It's time this ends. The room was quiet except for the sound of pens scratching notes. Jerry tried to argue, his voice rising, but the commissioners had already made their decision. The appeal was denied. The demolition order would proceed. Jerry's face turned pale. He slammed his hand on the table, muttering curses, but nobody flinched. The power he once wielded had no effect anymore. He walked out of that courthouse, not as the self-proclaimed king of the neighborhood, but as a man stripped bare. 2 weeks later, the crew arrived. Bulldozers and trucks lined the street. Neighbors gathered at their porches, some sipping coffee, others snapping photos. It wasn't just about a garage being torn down, it was the final act of justice. Linda slipped her hand into mine as the first wall crashed down. Dust filled the air, and the sound of splintering wood echoed through the neighborhood. I felt a weight lift off my chest, one I hadn't realized I'd been carrying all these years. When it was over, all that remained was a pile of rubble where Jerry's arrogance had stood. The county trucks cleared it away, leaving nothing but open ground. Jerry stood off to the side, his fists clenched, eyes full of rage but powerless. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. And as the last truck pulled away, I finally felt it closure. That night, the neighbors gathered at our house. We shared food, laughter, and relief. Derek raised a glass and said, "Here's to Robert, for standing tall, for reminding us what respect really means, and for showing us that sometimes patience is the sharpest sword." Everyone cheered, and I felt my throat tighten. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man who refused to be walked over. But in doing so, I had reclaimed more than just my land. I had reclaimed my dignity, my peace, and my community. As the laughter filled the room, Linda leaned close and whispered, "It's over, Robert. You've won." And she was right. For the first time in a long while, I could look around my home, my street, my life, and know I was truly at peace. If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too.